which is independent also of the bureaucracy. And so we have this wonderful architecture of an independent parliament, an independent judiciary, and an independent bureaucracy that does the bidding of parliament. And so on the face of it, we've got this wonderful, as I say, political and legal architecture. And so we would like to think that it is reflected in the pristine purity of the law, that the law is there to protect everybody in a civilised society, and that Australia lives in a rule of law society. And so there have been attempts to define what it is to be a rule of law society, and so one of the definitions is the restriction of the arbitrary exercise of power by subordinating it to well-defined and established laws. Now, that's a bit of a mouthful, but I'll get to understand a bit more about it in a minute. So, it's become common for politicians to proclaim that their government or their country is a rule of law country or a rule of law society. And they've actually sort of stolen the term from the legal profession because the term really is sort of grounded in the law. So I did some research to find out what eminent politicians claimed that their country was a rule of law society. The first person I came up with was George Bush after he had invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. The next person who has been identified as claiming a rule society is Vladimir Putin, the Russian president. The next person is Hu Jintao, who used to be president of China. Another person has claimed sort of allegiance to the rule of law is Vicente Fox, the ex-president of Mexico. Just recently, the foreign minister for Vietnam claimed that they wanted a rule of law society in the South Chinese Sea. Then there was a famous sort of defender of civil society, Robert Mugabe, who claimed allegiance to the rule of law society. And an ex-president of Indonesia, President Khatami of Iran, and I can't remember his first name, Rodstrom, who was a warlord in Afghanistan. They have all claimed that allegiance to the rule of law society, but they are all politicians. And so it's safe to say that when a politician claims to allegiance to the rule of law, they are either doing it to sort of have a fig leaf to cover some irregularity, or they're going to do something terrible. So, as against that, the lawyers and sort of legal philosophers have pursued the concept of the rule of law, almost like the searching for the philosopher's stone, you know, and just having a bit of difficulty with my technology here, so forgive me for playing with it. And so the lawyers have a concept called, or the discipline called jurisprudence, which is sort of the study, the theory of law. You know, what is it that gives law this sanctity that we obey it? That when a law is passed, we accept it, and if we don't obey it, we're punished. So what sanctifies the law to give it so much power over us? And so legal philosophers have sort of searched sort of over the centuries for some reason that gives validity to law. And they've come up with concepts of natural law, natural justice, divine law, and more recently the international law has introduced protocols that try to sort of codify some of these essential concepts of law, but we ignore them in Australia. And in Australia we have the Constitution, which determines the legality of our laws. Pardon me. I just wanted to drink water. He's coughing as an excuse. And so, on the 1st of January 1900, the English Parliament passed to the Australian government a constitution that determined the future direction of law in Australia, and the constitution contains in section 51 all the powers of federal parliament. And the law clearly is that within those powers, like defence, immigration, telecommunications, the federal parliament can pass any law it likes, and it will become effectively law, irrespective of whether it impinges on civil rights. And so that is the defining characteristic of legality at the federal level in Australia. They had the opportunity, when they were drafting the Constitution, to have a Bill of Rights, such as in America, but they decided not to, because Western Australia said, no, we need to discriminate against Asians and Africans, and so we can't have a sort of Bill of Rights in the Constitution, so that is why we don't have a Bill of Rights. So the Constitution now is the whipping boy for law in Australia, and the Philosopher's Stone is still a pursuit of people like me that hopefully one day something else might sort of influence the direction of law. So I wanted to sort of briefly talk about some constitutional theory. In 1906, a Chinese person came to Australia, and in those days, the White Australia policy, and they had a language test, and they subjected him, because he was Asian, to a language test, and he failed, and they said, no, you can't enter Australia. It turns out that he was the son of a woman who had British woman before Federation. He had British citizenship, and he left Australia when he was 5 and came back when he was 25. And so they said he was an immigrant and had to be subjected to this test. Fortunately, the High Court developed this theory called the theory of legality, which said for a law to deprive a person of their fundamental civil rights, it has to use language that unmistakably indicate the desire to do so. And unless there's that unmistakable language indicating that we wanted to deny you your civil rights, the law will read the legislation down to preserve civil rights. And so they said, no, this person's not an immigrant in the sense that you want to say it is, because if you interpret the legislation that way, you would be depriving him of his civil rights as a British citizen to enter Australia. And so we had this wonderful concept of legality, which, pardon me, has been turned on its head. Later, in the First World War, wartime regulations gave the Minister for Defence or the Attorney General power to intern people if they were considered them to be disaffected aliens. And so Mr. Wallet, who was a naturalised Australian, noticed, and he was interned, and he objected, and he said the Minister should give reasons for my internment, for my imprisonment. And the High Court in its wisdom said, no, they don't have to do that, that's fine. It has power to sort of pass these laws, and so it passed the laws, and you interned for the term of the natural, for the duration of the war. And so we had these two concurrent sort of theories. One was the uninhibited power of Parliament to pass laws to deprive people of their civil rights. And on the other hand, sort of a tendency of the court to say, look, we have to soften it a bit by sort of making sure that we don't go too far with our legislation that deprives people of civil rights. They've determined the direction of our law ever since. So I want to sort of briefly look at how this plays out in practice. A couple of years ago, a guy called Tim Smith, an ex-Supreme Court judge, approached me on behalf of two other Supreme Court judges who were chairman of the Accountability Round Table. Back in 2010, the Parliament introduced laws they introduced the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, and the reason was that the bureaucracy was refusing to properly provide documents under freedom from information. You'd request it and they'd have all sorts of excuses for not to give it, and then if they gave it, you're redacted, and everybody was screaming. So they introduced this Office of Australian Information Commissioner to supervise the operation of freedom from information. In 2015, Attorney General Brandis introduced legislation to abolish that office, and fortunately it didn't get past the Senate. And so when Tim came to me, what had happened was that Brandis had then told the bureaucracy to withdraw funds from the office so that they couldn't actually employ anybody. So anyway, Tim came to me and wanted to know if the International Commission of Jurists could do something, and I looked at it and I said, we've got a wonderful doctrine here in Australia called the Doctrine of Separation of Powers. And the Doctrine of Separation of Powers says that, and we'll talk a bit more about it later, there's the legislature, there's the judiciary, and then there's the executive, and not any of them can transgress the domain of the others. And so I said to Tim, look, what's happening here is that Brandis is trying to do executively what he can't do legislatively, and he's trying to use the bureaucracy to prevent the implementation of legislation. It's a clear breach of the Doctrine of Separation of Powers. What occurred to me was, how could any person in a civilised society called to be a rule of law society even contemplate such an act? Anyway, I drafted a letter which we got the National President to sign, and fortunately we now have an Australian Information Commissioner, and I guess speaker who's annoying you with this. Pardon me. I got my GP here and sort of fix it in a minute.
I can always talk in between while he's talking. Whatever walking fit, and then I'll just chat away.
So then, another case that I came across was, I sort of can't talk too much about it because it's just sort of subdued to say, but the Planning and Environment Act provides in section 36 that the Minister must publish a notice of the approval of an amendment in the Government Gazette specifying the place or places at which any person may inspect the amendment. What happens is when you pass legislation, like the Federal Parliament passes legislation, when a Minister sort of passes what we call subordinate legislation by way of regulations, and they go through the process and all the documents are signed, the law is, and has been for centuries, for a very good reason, they must publish it in the Gazette so that everybody knows about it. It's absolutely critical, and the reason that they've done it is to prevent dirty works at the crossroads, so that if you pass legislation that somebody doesn't like it, they can come along to the Minister and say, don't present it. And so the law is sacred, it must publish it. These two gentlemen, the Minister for the Crown and the Federal Parliament and the person who was then a Minister in the Victorian Parliament, conspired after legislation had been passed to prevent it being gazetted. And in order to cover the traces, forked out millions of dollars of taxpayers' money. So, you think that's bad? I can't tell you much about this because I signed a document filed in the Supreme Court so that I won't tell anybody about it, otherwise I'll be guilty of contempt, so just keep it. There were two major American corporations listed on the New York Stock Exchange that were having discussions about whether one would compete in Australia against an Australian statutory body. And they had the public servant of that statutory authority waiting outside the meeting in New York. And one of the gentlemen from one of the big listed companies on the New York Stock Exchange came out and said, look, we can close down the competitor, but we're $1 million US short. Can the taxpayer fork up $1 million? Yeah, that's fine. We get foreign investment boards and sort of legislation and all sorts of things like that, you know, that's fine. But wait, and I can't tell you that sort of, here's $1 million to close down a competitor from the taxpayer. The Americans then got it and they said, oh, we've got to pay tax on this. So they go back to the statutory authority. Can you help us sort of avoid tax? Yeah, that's fine, we can do it. Now, I can't go into the details. It took me sort of months of sort of unearthing this disaster. And so they're just 3 stories of me being involved in sort of egregious conduct beneath this wonderful architecture of democracy in Australia. And I think there are thousands and thousands of lawyers in Australia. Am I only the lucky one that's sort of come across these abuses? And I think, I wonder just how
local level as well.
Well, you know,
Absolutely.
and so I think, I just wonder how widespread this is. And then I sort of talk to my mates and oh yeah, look, I had a case like that. And so, all this is happening and we don't know. And I have to sign a document, file in the Supreme Court to say I won't tell a soul about what I've found, otherwise it'll be in contempt. Anyway, that's sort of, let's move on. More serious stuff. Alan Johnson, he's sort of, he's a fan of his, and he was famous for the quotation, "You ain't heard nothing yet." But I think it was plagiarised from Enrico Caruso, but that's another point. So more seriously, Lord Acton, sort of in the House of Lords in the 19th century, made this wonderful statement, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I meant to put a thing there about a more recent judge, Sir Owen Dixon, who sat on the, probably the most famous judge on the Australian High Court, that sort of said in 1951 that the trajectory to authoritarianism is transferring more and more power to the bureaucracy. And he sort of gave a warning to us all in those days that's been ignored about this tendency to grant more authority to the bureaucracy. Now, it's time for a break, sorry. One of the most sort of unfortunate legal books to have ever been written is this book published in about 1876 by John Austin, who was a legal philosopher. And he's influenced the law ever since. And he came up with the definition of the legality of law, and he said, look, if you have a body or body of people that have the authority to pass a law, and the law is published so that everybody knows what it is and it's gazetted, and that the body has the power to enforce the law, well then that's law. It's positive law. Forget whether it sort of deprives people of human rights or anything like that. That is the definition of law and has been adopted in our jurisprudence ever since. Sadly, there was a terrible episode, and the National Socialists were elected by the German people to govern. They passed laws that were published and were chillingly sort of definite in what they were trying to do, and they had the power to enforce those laws. And according to positivist theory, they became the law. And so suddenly people said, well, perhaps there should be limits to positivism. And so, fortunately, a German professor called Professor Radbrook came on the scene. And he'd been a positivist before the war, and then he saw the ghastly consequences of that theory, and so he came up with another theory called statutory lawlessness. That even if you pass a law, if it's sort of so pernicious, if it's so obscene in depriving people of their civil rights, it loses its legality. And German courts, after the Second World War and then after the fall of Berlin Wall, actually adopted Radbroke's theory in sort of convicting people who did criminal acts in those regimes. However, that has not entered into Australian politics, and we are still confronted with this doctrine that the Constitution, if you pass a law according to the powers conferred on you, the law is the law. And so, just recently, in order to give some sort of coherence to the law and sort of take it out of politics, there was a Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales, Sir Thomas Bingham, wonderful lawyer. He died about 2008. Wrote a book and he identified 8 principles of the rule of law, and I won't bore you with them because it becomes quite technical. But suddenly we had, at this late stage, a technical definition of rules of law. And Australia is in breach of all of these. But I just wanted to talk about one, which he says, the law must be clear, intelligible and predictable. So we have, as I say, the doctrine of the separation of powers, which is the Parliament, and then we have our High Court, and then we have our bureaucracy, and they say, you know, warning, don't trespass. So everybody is aware of the fact that we've got a refugee problem, and that there are sort of people locked up in indefinite detention and almost in terrible circumstances. And there was one person who was a refugee, and he was recognised as a refugee according to the Status of Refugees Protocol in the United Nations by the Australian government. And he applied for asylum protection visa. And he qualified for it, except that the security department said no, he's a risk to national security, and they didn't have to give any reason. And so he wanted to appeal the decision because the legislation said that a person who had this protection of being a protected refugee under the protocol had a right to appeal. And he was refused appeal. He could not be deported to another country, and so he was facing life detention in a detention centre in Australia, because the law is if you can't get a valid visa and if you can't be exported to another country, you have to remain in detention. And so he was facing, this is a case of a guy facing life detention. Now I just want to give you an extract out of the 187-page judgment. And now this is a real test for you. You've had a nice glass of wine and everything, and you sort of brain cells are going, your acumen is fantastic. Schedule 1 of the regulations prescribes criteria in item 1401 for protection in brackets class XA, close brackets visa, which specifies as the subclass on 866 protection, in brackets, inverted commas, visa. The designation of that subclass identifies the part of the Schedule 2 that applies in relation to the protection class XA visa. That is the part headed subclass 866 protection. That part of Schedule 2 sets out in Division 866.2 primary criteria to be satisfied at the time of decision. Secondary criteria are set out in Divisions 866.33. One primary and a person's head and why I can't read the rest of it.
That's clear.
That is in a judgment of a judge on the High Court of this country, for God's sake, determining whether a guy's going to be locked up for life. Now, there are 20 pieces of separate legislation that the Immigration Department has sort of forked together to try and stop people from getting asylum. And you get this stuff. Now, there are 16 barristers, 7 judges, all the 7 judges giving different decisions in esoteric bullshit. And like I'm reading this stuff, I haven't got the faintest idea what they're talking about.
I was going to say something else.
But then I sort of really sat down and sort of went through it with a fine-tooth comb. It took me weeks. And I'm going to see any lawyers in there? No, that's right. I'm going to see if you can answer this question. The Immigration Act said that this person, if he had these criteria, had a right to appeal. Regulations made under the Act said he doesn't have a right to appeal. Now then, I know it's a difficult question, but I'm going to ask you, what do you think would take precedence? The Act of Parliament. And that's what they decided. Now then, I can't start to convey to you the problems that we've got with the High Court getting off on all this. You can't imagine, like, 200 pages, everybody having a different go at it, and people's lives, their future, their sort of security, their liberty is dependent upon it. And so I think when the law becomes so complicated that 7 judges can't agree on it, and after 16 barristers talking for 6 weeks, can we really say that we're a rule of law society? And this is a great case. This was a guy, he applied for a visa, couldn't get it. He couldn't be sent back to his country because he'd be persecuted. So he said, I want to be deported to another country. So the immigration hunted around, sorry, there's no other country that'll take you, so you have to remain in permanent detention. Now, do you remember the Doctrine of Separation of Powers? That sort of judges decide whether people are deprived of their liberty, not the bureaucracy. And so here the bureaucracy have come to court and say, no, we want to lock this guy up forever because we can't send him to another country and we're not going to give him a visa. Guess what? The High Court said, it's fine. And so here was this guy sort of subject to permanent deprivation of liberty, and it's sort of a complicated sort of story between different judges about how they came to it. Deprivation of liberty forever, without ever seeing the inside of a court, having a lawyer, sort of a judge trying the case, just on the signature of a bureaucrat in an office. And so this George William, lovely guy, he's professor of law at the University of New South Wales and Dean, and he gave me a lot of material, and this is what he came up with. He said there are 5 fundamental freedoms under threat: freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of association, freedom of movement, freedom of protest. He did research at the University of New South Wales with all his students and came up and identified 350 separate statutes, mainly federal, that offended all of those freedoms. So in 1951, the federal parliament, because of the communist scare, introduced legislation to abolish not to abolish the Communist Party, to put it into receivership. So the federal parliament passed an act putting the Communist Party in receivership, and they appealed that judgment to the High Court. And sort of the High Court said, look, that's not one of the powers. The federal parliament doesn't have power to put companies into receivership or political parties into receivership, so an appeal was unsuccessful. But what was interesting in this case was that Sir Alan Dixon, to whom I referred earlier, said in a wonderful passage of his judgment, one of the assumptions of the Australian Constitution is that it's based on the rule of law. And he was trying to sort of get across the point, like sort of banning political parties, you know, we've got the rule of law here, but because it wasn't really part of the law, he couldn't sort of hang his hat on it. But he introduced it into the dialogue of constitutional law in Australia. And so I've sort of done a lot of research to find out what the end result of that was and how much effect it has had on statutory interpretation since, and I came up with this. It has not been referred to once, well, only once recently where a judge said it's never been referred to. And so much for the...
Sorry, we're just getting billed. I'm sorry.
You're okay, I can keep going. We're not gonna...
Sorry, I thought there was a... This is beauty. Buying ice cream in Australia is a good lane when solid that's So there were 3 guys, admittedly bikies. They were walking down the street. They were on holidays in the Gold Coast and sort of going to buy an ice cream for their family, and they were arrested by the police, locked up, put in solid confinement for 3 weeks, and they were allowed out 1 hour a day because the bail laws in Queensland have been adjusted to say that these people, and it turned out that the law said that if 3 members of a prescribed organisation met in public, that's an offence. And so they met in public to buy an ice cream. They said, oh, they're bikies. Like, you know, we're talking about sort of fundamental legal rights. And so they got locked up and sort of, finally after about 6 or 8 months, they were released without charge. So, you know, that was a terrible event. The bastardry of it is just mind-boggling. You just can't even conceive of people being so evil. And so when this happened, there was a move to introduce what we call terrorist legislation. Generally speaking, criminal lawyers around the country felt that our criminal laws and our criminal justice system was adequate to deal with terrorists because they were just doing nasty things like other people do nasty things. And all you have to do is get the evidence that they've done it and sort of charge them with the crime, they get convicted and then you put in prison, throw away the key. So we introduced Australian terrorist laws here in Australia, and I was asked to sort of do a paper on it for the International Commission of Jurists. So I'm only going to sort of talk about a couple of things because quite apart from sort of creating a terrorist law, which is different to sort of an ordinary law, the definition of a terrorist law is a sort of an act causing harm for political, ideological or religious reasons. So, you know, you can contemplate that for a second. But anyway, what I discovered was that for terrorists, they were going to change the procedure. For instance, in Australia, according to terrorist law, a person charged with terrorism can't have a lawyer of their own choice. They have to sort of have a lawyer appointed by the prosecution. The law says that if the prosecution says that there's legal, national security sensitive evidence, both the lawyer and the accused can be forced to be absent from the court whilst that evidence is given. In other words, you can have a lawyer, have a person represented by a lawyer, appointed by the prosecution, who's then not allowed to sort of be in court whilst evidence is given, and then suddenly you might get convicted. That's on the statute in Australia. And like when you get political, ideological or religious sort of connotations, you just wonder sort of where the trajectory might end up. Now everybody had a bit of fun lately, you know. that was, you know, it's made newspapers for the next, you know, however long I suppose, but it's been fun. And so back in about 2006, Australia was in negotiations with East Timor for the allocation of oil rights in the Timor Sea. And Timor came out and they got a bit of a hiding. They didn't do well over the negotiations. Australia ended up with a lion's share of the action. It then came to pass, believe it or not, you're not going to believe this, right? But the Australian government had bugged the officers of the Indonesian government and got sort of information about them that it helped them in the negotiations to screw the Timorese. So the Timorese suddenly came across this bugging device and said, hey, wait, we've been taken to the cleaners here. We're going to The Hague to sort of get all this set aside. So the government said, that's fine. So they sent their henchmen into the lawyer acting for the Timorese government in Canberra and took all his documents. And then there was a witness who was going to be giving evidence at The Hague. They took his passport, and so he couldn't give evidence. Fortunately, the international community kicked up a fuss and Australia ended up putting their hand and they went back to the negotiating table, and as you know, they've just sort of settled recently, and Timor have now got a lot more of the... Like this happened in Australia for the Australian government, bugging, you know. We talk about shooting. So, we treasure freedom of speech, But Section 42 of the Border Force Act was introduced to prevent people such as doctors, social workers, dentists, carers who visited detention centres from revealing anything that they learned whilst they were there, under pain of penalty, minimum sentence of 2 years imprisonment. And so, you know, you've got doctors sort of seeing all this sort of stuff, and under pain of penalty, sort of, if we talked about it, we'd go to jail. The United Nations want to send a delegate to investigate the sort of circumstances, and they withdrew their team for fear of prosecution. And so, like, yeah, just unbelievable. But the Australian Parliament, because it has got power, can pass laws that deprive people of their civil rights. And then just recently, you know, the proposed criminalisation of publishing leaked documents by journalists about, they say, national security sensitive documents, and national security is defined as that way. The journalists are screaming because they can see that their members going to jail if they sort of publish something that sort of drops on their lap or sort of comes across their doorstep. I won't spend any time on this, but people are just unaware of the extent of the deprivations of civil liberties of people in our detention centres. They have never committed an offence. They have a perfect, legitimate right to have their claim for asylum processed. That right is denied. We're in breach of every conceivable aspect of international law in relation to treatment of asylum seekers. And the whole purpose of their incarceration in those awful conditions is to send a message back. So this is what happens if you seek asylum. Now, I'm not justifying sort of the boat people and all that sort of stuff and people smugglers. But at the end of the day, when innocent people who have never been charged with any offence, who have never committed any offence, have no access to courts, no access to justice, and are locked up in awful circumstances. And the stories, you know. And so we're talking about Australian rule of society. So just wanted to talk about the fallout of all this approach. So Australia has now introduced a law which enables the minister to cancel a person's citizenship if they are a terrorist or a member of certain organisations. So what happens if a person comes up and says, you've got it wrong, you know, I'm innocent, I'm not a member of, I'm not a terrorist, you know, I want to sort of contest it, I've got evidence, I can come to court and prove that I'm not a terrorist. No. Absolutely no. And we're talking about the doctrine of separation of powers. A person can be deprived of their citizenship by ministerial fear without any opportunity of challenging it. So, and then Dr. Hanif, you probably know the story. Perfectly innocent person, very decent doctor, said to be a great asset to, I think, a hospital on the Gold Coast, was at Brisbane Airport to go on holidays, and he was arrested, put in solitary confinement. His family could not see him for 10 days. They had no access to lawyers. Subjected to sort of interrogation by the sort of Border Force police. Visa sort of withdrawn, and I won't go into the details, but after a horrific sort of time, oh, sorry, we made a mistake, you're totally innocent. Not totally innocent, like virtually innocent, sort of just incomprehensibly innocent. And so, in 2015, an 18-year-old lad in Melbourne was arrested in April on suspected terrorist charges, kept in solitary confinement for 5 months and released in August without charge. And, then, this was the beauty. In August 2015, the Border Force police deployed themselves on the streets of Melbourne with the intention of stopping and interviewing people at will. Thank God the Victorian police woke up before it could sort of get... But what brain-dead person ever dreamed of subjecting a civil society to the imposition of Border Force police that could stop you on the street and sort of interview you? So David Hicks was a story that he was arrested by the police in Afghanistan because a taxi driver was paid by the American military $5,000 to dock people in, so he got $5,000 to say he's a terrorist. He was subjected to 5 years intense, awful, solid confinement and torture. The Australian government, through the ICJ, sought to intervene to sort of get him a fair trial before a properly constituted court, and it refused. They said, no, he's a terrorist, he's a crook, he's a terrible person, Americans have a right to do him what they're doing at Guantanamo Bay, we support them in every... So Dan Murray, an American Marine lawyer, and I'm privileged to have become a close friend of his, stuck his neck out and stood against the establishment. And finally, Hicks pleaded guilty to a crime, was sentenced to 7 years imprisonment, which he had already served 5 years, and then he came to Australia to serve another 9 months, and then he was released on a control order. The American Supreme Court held that the law to which he pleaded guilty was invalid, and the Americans have now said he was totally innocent. I just get sickened when I sort of come across these stories of what's happening in our country. Then we get the attacks on the legal profession. Professor Julian Trigg, wonderful woman, great leading lawyer, appointed Human Rights Commissioner. And one of the functions of the Human Rights Commissioner is to sort of stand between government and authoritarianism. So the government didn't like her, Brandeis and Abbott. They insisted, they subjected to just the most obscene criticism and insisted that she resign. Unfortunately, she had the courage to stay and sort of, she wouldn't resign. More recently, Peter Dutton, the Minister for Border Force, has attacked the legal profession and says that the rate of crime in Victoria as a result of the sort of the indulgence of the Victorian judiciary that are soft on criminals, and sort of launched a bitter attack on the Victorian legal profession, and particularly Lex Lasry. And Lex, I know him, we sat on the committee of the ICJ for some years, absolutely incredibly integrated lawyer, completely disinterested and fair, and Dutton came out recently and said that he was a left-wing ideologue. And more recently, Dutton, in an interview with the radio station in Sydney, said that Australian lawyers who act for refugees are un-Australian. So then that doesn't stop, then they get onto the judiciary. The sentencing of a criminal is an incredibly difficult and highly technical process, because criminals are convicted range from people who are the most unbelievably remorseful sort of people to those hardened criminals who are just sort of obscenely disgraceful. And the circumstances vary in each case, and so a judge has to sit down and decide how to impose a penalty given all these various factors. And so what the Parliament's now doing, because of this, we have to be tough on crime, they're taking away that discretion from judges, and they're mandating minimum sentences so that the judge no longer has any discretion. Not only that, recently they've introduced legislation that people who have actually served their time according to the sentence imposed by the judge will continue nevertheless to have to remain in prison. Now, you know, they say they're sex offenders and all that sort of stuff, but we start, like, every step of the way we seem to be moving away from this concept of civility and the rule of law. And so there just doesn't seem to be one segment of the community that's not subject to these impositions. Well, I finish by talking about, on the 25th of January 1788, this country was populated by 750,000 people that had occupied the country for 60,000 years. On the 26th of January 1788, Captain Arthur Phillip planted his flag in Sydney and Sydney Cove, at which stage something miraculous happened. The law of England sort of became the law of this country. There was a bit of a problem that the lawyers came up with and said, look, the law of England is that for the law of England to be imposed on another people, like the indigenous population of Australia, it can only be done by consent of the people or by treaty. If the country is occupied, that's the only way you can impose British law. Well, they said, that's fine because it's not occupied. These people are just sort of uncivilised nomads sort of roaming around the countryside. We don't have to worry about that, they're not occupied. And so the indigenous population miraculously became, without them knowing it, subject to British law. So in 1971, a tribe up in the Northern Territory had a go at Camalco that wanted to sort of a mine up there, and they called archaeological evidence that the judge was convinced, and he's found that the indigenous population were a highly sophisticated, civilised society that learned to live in a harsh country according to clear rules and culture, and that this culture and the civilisation had been in operation for thousands of years. And so it could no longer be maintained that Australia in those days were unoccupied. So the Murray Islanders came along in a case called Marbo, and he said, well, look, we've had the Murray Islanders, we've occupied here ever before 1788, and so they came to the High Court and said, look, we want to be recognised as having native title to this land. What's interesting about that is that sort of the rape is coming to the raper for forgiveness, because the indigenous population is a supplicant to an Anglo-Saxon court. That's so anyway, the High Court, after 250 pages of a lot of unbelievable stuff, said, yeah, there is native title, but then they were confronted with a problem, because there's the Opera House and sort of the Parliament House and your house and your the farm, and there's all built on native title. And so they got out of the wonderful legal fiction, and they said, oh, but yeah, you've got native title, but the tide of history has washed away native title. And so the illegality sort of legalises the illegality. So we now have in Australia an indigenous population of 2% of the population and 27% of the prison population. Its life expectancy is 10 years less than ours. Deaths in custody of indigenous population are sort of legendary. The damage that we've done to the culture, if you go to the Northern Territory, see what we've done just under the doctrine of assimilation, what we've just destroyed. We're guilty of genocide in Tasmania. And so, to me, when the indigenous population comes to us for recognition, I think it's wrong. I think if we're going to be a law society, we have to change the narrative. And I think we have to get to the stage where we come to the indigenous population and say, look, I know everything, we've done terrible things, but we can't turn back the clock. But you now tell us what we need to do for you to accept us. And until we can get that narrative, I don't think we can ever be a rule of law society. So in 1956, a German theologian wrote this piece of poetry, and you're probably aware of it. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist.
And then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak up because it was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me like Dr. Hanif. So, fortunately, we're not at that stage, but my second career was that of management consultant. And when you go into an organisation as a management consultant, you start looking at trajectories, you know, as a sort of the profit going up or down, as the cash flow sort of, and we look at trajectories and start getting an idea of the direction of the corporation. So I look at this and say, well, look, you know, we're not anywhere near this. But what's the trajectory? Where does it stop? And so I made a list of people or institutions that are so far affected by these rule of law insults: terrorists, refugees, sex offenders, bikies, judges, the legal profession, trade unions, journalists, professionals visiting refugee centres, and currently the Catholic Church. Now you can say all sorts of things about them, they're bad, and the pedophilia, and sort of the sex offenders, and but if we have to sacrifice the basic values of the rule of law in order to bring those people to account, I think we have to ask ourselves, you know, what sort of society we're living in. I've just given you a sort of potpourri of sort of a few of the manifold insults that we're inflicting daily in this country to the rule of law. And I just worry that the trajectory is in the wrong direction.